On the outskirts of Millbrook Valley stands a weathered barn that holds more than just forgotten memories. For Sarah Lancaster, the elegant widow of the town's most prominent businessman, it represents everything she's lost, a reminder of happier days when laughter echoed through her estate. But fate works in mysterious ways, especially on autumn evenings when desperation leads weary souls to unexpected sanctuaries. Enter Michael Foster, a man who once built homes but now owns nothing more than the tools in his worn backpack and the skills in his calloused hands. He only wanted shelter for the night, but something about the barn's broken spirit called to his own. What he couldn't know, as he methodically repaired each splintered board and rusted hinge, was that someone was watching, someone who recognized in his quiet dedication a reflection of her own loneliness. In the days that follow, two souls, separated by circumstance but united by shared emptiness, will discover that sometimes the strongest foundations are built on nothing more than a chance encounter and an act of kindness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Lancaster's mornings always began the same way, with the echo of her heels against hardwood floors that seemed to grow longer and emptier with each passing year. The grandfather clock in the foyer, a wedding gift from Thomas's parents, who 30 years ago chimed 7 times as she made her way down the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the mahogany banister that needed polishing again. The kitchen, despite its professional-grade appliances and marble countertops, felt more like a museum than a place where meals should be shared. She prepared her usual breakfast, Earl Grey tea and toast with honey, and carried it to the morning room, where the autumn sun painted golden rectangles on the antique Persian rug. Thomas had always teased her about being creatures of habit, the way they'd sit here every morning, planning their day while watching the estate come alive. 5 years since the cancer took him, and still she set 2 cups on the silver tray each morning, only to put one back, unused. Their children, both successful and busy with their own lives in distant cities, called dutifully every Sunday. But their voices couldn't fill the vastness of the 20-room manor that had once buzzed with life and laughter. The estate itself was showing signs of neglect that would have horrified Thomas. The once pristine gardens were becoming overgrown, the tennis court needed resurfacing, and the roof of the pool house had started to leak. Their longtime groundskeeper, Mr. Peterson, had retired last spring, and finding reliable help in Millbrook Valley had proved nearly impossible. The local handymen either overcharged outrageously or treated her with the kind of condescending patience reserved for helpless widows. Sarah sipped her tea and gazed out at the morning mist rising from the meadow. The barn at the edge of the property stood as a particularly painful reminder of decay. Thomas had always meant to restore it, talking endlessly about converting it into a workshop where he'd pursue woodworking in retirement. Now it sagged against the horizon, its red paint faded to a dusty rose, its doors hanging askew on rusted hinges. Movement near the barn caught her eye. At first, she thought it might be deer. They often grazed in the tall grass around dawn. But this was different. A figure, definitely human, moving with purpose around the building's perimeter. Sarah's heart quickened. She should call the police. That would be the sensible thing to do. Instead, she found herself reaching for the antique spyglass Thomas had kept on the windowsill for birdwatching. Through the lens, she could make out a man, tall and lean, studying the barn structure with what appeared to be professional interest. His clothes were worn but clean, his movements deliberate and careful as he examined the hanging door. There was something about his demeanor that didn't match her image of a typical trespasser. He carried himself with dignity despite his obvious circumstances, and when he removed his backpack to withdraw what looked like tools, his actions spoke of expertise rather than ill intent. Sarah watched, transfixed, as he began to work on the door's hinges. His movements were precise, efficient, speaking of years of experience. He worked continuously for over an hour, stopping only occasionally to wipe his brow or take small sips from a water bottle. She found herself admiring his methodical approach, the way he seemed to care about doing the job properly, despite having no obligation to do so. The mornings slipped away as she observed him, her tea growing cold, forgotten. Around her, the great house creaked and settled, a constant reminder of its slow decline. Sarah had interviewed countless contractors about repairs, but none had shown the kind of careful attention this stranger was giving to a simple barn door. Perhaps, she thought, watching him secure the last hinge with confident movements, sometimes help arrives in unexpected forms. A rational voice in her head, one that sounded remarkably like her daughter Jessica, warned her against romanticizing the situation. He was, after all, a stranger on her property, but another voice, one that had been silent since Thomas's passing, whispered of opportunity, of the mysterious ways life sometimes answered unspoken prayers. Sarah stood, her decision made before she fully realized it. The breakfast dishes clinked softly as she gathered them, her movements purposeful for the first time in what felt like years. She would approach him, she decided, not with accusations or threats, but with an offer. After all, what did she have to lose that wasn't already slipping away? Michael Foster had learned to read buildings the way others read faces. The barn before him spoke volumes: Victorian era, hand-hewn beams, mortise and tenon joints that had held strong for over a century. Even in its current state of disrepair, he could see the craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. The kind of craftsmanship that seemed to belong to another era, much like his own former life. Just 3 years ago, he had been Michael Foster, owner of Foster Construction, with 30 employees and a reputation for being the best custom home builder in Cincinnati. His company logo had adorned trucks across the city, and his calendar had been booked 18 months in advance. The local business journal had even featured him in their 40 Under 40 issue, praising his innovative approach to sustainable luxury homes. Then came 2022, and with it, the perfect storm: 3 major clients declaring bankruptcy mid-project, a supplier scandal that left him with thousands of dollars in defective materials, and finally, the market crash that froze all new construction. He'd tried everything to save the company, mortgaging his house, liquidating his retirement accounts, even selling his late father's prized collection of vintage woodworking tools. But in the end, it hadn't been enough. The bankruptcy proceedings had been quick and clinical. His lawyers had advised him well. He'd managed to protect his clients' deposits and ensure his employees received their final paychecks. But it had left him with nothing except his personal tools and a crushing sense of failure. His wife Janet, who'd already been distant since their son left for college, filed for divorce shortly after. She couldn't understand why he'd sacrificed their personal finances to pay off business debts he wasn't legally obligated to cover. "It's about integrity," he'd tried to explain. "Those people trusted us with their money." "And what about our money?" she'd responded. "What about our trust?" The memory still stung as he ran his calloused hands along the barn's weathered siding. He'd been on the road ever since, picking up odd jobs where he could find them. Some days he worked as a handyman, others as a day laborer on construction sites. He never stayed in one place long enough for people to ask too many questions, or worse, offer too much sympathy. His tools were all he had left now, a basic set he'd assembled from pawn shops and hardware store sales. They weren't the professional-grade equipment he'd once owned, but they were enough to keep his hands busy and his skills sharp. The tool belt around his waist might be worn, and his boots might have seen better days, but his standards hadn't slipped. He still approached every job, no matter how small, with the same attention to detail that had once made him successful. The barn door's problem was simple enough: rusted hinges and rotted wood around the mounting points. He had enough screws in his pack to reinforce the frame, and the hinges just needed cleaning and proper lubrication. It would take a few hours of work, but it would keep him occupied until sunset. Then he could sleep inside, sheltered from the autumn chill, and move on in the morning. As he worked, muscle memory took over. The familiar movements brought him back to his first construction job at 16, learning from old-timers who believed in doing things right or not at all. He'd absorbed their knowledge like a sponge, the proper angle to drive a nail, how to read the grain of wood, the importance of measuring twice and cutting once. Those lessons had served him well during his rise to success, and they served him still in his reduced circumstances. The property around him spoke of wealth, but also of neglect. He could see a dozen small repairs needed just from where he stood, gutters that needed cleaning, trim that needed painting, stonework that needed repointing. In his previous life, this would have been exactly the kind of project he loved, restoring a grand old estate to its former glory. Now he could only spare a few hours to fix a barn door, a small gesture of gratitude for the shelter it would provide. The sun climbed higher as he worked, and with it came memories of job sites he'd managed, homes he'd built, dreams he'd helped realize. He remembered the pride in his clients' eyes during final walkthroughs, the satisfaction of seeing families build lives within walls he'd raised. Those memories no longer carried the sharp pain they had in the early days of his downfall. Time had dulled them to a quiet ache, like an old injury that only bothered him in cold weather. He paused briefly to take a drink from his water bottle, surveying his progress. The door now hung straight and true, opening and closing smoothly on its cleaned hinges. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was honest work, well done. Sometimes that had to be enough. What he didn't know, as he gathered his tools and prepared to inspect the barn's interior, was that this small act of repair was about to change the course of his life. But then again, the best foundations are often laid when we least expect them, built not from concrete and steel, but from simple acts of care and quiet moments of grace. The barn's interior revealed itself slowly as Michael eased open the newly repaired door. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that pierced the gloom, illuminating what must have once been a magnificent structure. The soaring ceiling rose to exposed beams, their oak timbers still solid despite years of neglect. Someone had once taken great pride in this place. The joinery alone spoke of master craftsmanship. From her vantage point at the kitchen window, Sarah watched the stranger disappear inside. She should have felt afraid, or at least concerned, but something about his careful handling of the door repair had stirred memories of Thomas. Her late husband had approached every project with that same methodical attention to detail, that same respect for good workmanship. Inside the barn, Michael was making mental notes. The roof would need attention before winter. He could spot at least 3 places where daylight shouldn't be visible. The floor was surprisingly sound, though years of accumulated debris obscured its true condition. Without thinking, he began to clear a space, stacking old crates against one wall, sweeping decades of dust and straw into neat piles with a broken-handled broom he'd found propped in a corner. Sarah had moved to her study, which offered a better view of the barn's entrance. She watched as the man emerged briefly, disappearing around the side of the building, only to return with an armful of wild goldenrod and asters. Puzzled, she observed as he placed them carefully in an old milk bottle he'd obviously found inside. The simple arrangement now sat in the barn's entrance, an unexpected touch of beauty amid decay. The gesture brought unexpected tears to her eyes. How long had it been since anyone had thought to add beauty to any part of her property? The gardeners she occasionally hired simply mowed and trimmed, treating her land as a task to be completed rather than a place to be cared for. Michael, unaware of his audience, had moved on to the barn's massive windows. Years of grime had reduced them to vague suggestions of glass, but he could tell their mechanisms were largely intact. Finding a rag in his pack, he dampened it with water from his bottle and began cleaning a small section. The difference was immediate. Clear autumn sunlight streamed through, illuminating the interior in a way it hadn't seen in years. Something about the transformation of that single window pane struck Sarah deeply. She'd watched countless paid workers trudge through their tasks on her property, but none had shown this kind of voluntary care. None had thought to bring flowers or let in light. In the barn, Michael stepped back to admire the effect of the cleaned window. The space had potential, tremendous potential. His trained eye could see past the dust and debris to what it could become. The basic structure was sound, and the craftsmanship of its original construction had protected it from the worst ravages of time. With proper attention, this barn could be magnificent again. He found himself sketching possibilities on the back of an old envelope from his pack. The main space could be opened up, the loft reinforced. Those windows, once cleaned, would provide excellent natural light. The eastern wall could use some reinforcement, but the fix would be straightforward enough. He caught himself mid-thought. These weren't his problems to solve. By tomorrow, he'd be moving on, leaving this place as he'd left countless others. Sarah had made her way to the garden path, her heart pounding with an uncertainty she hadn't felt in years. The last time she'd approached a stranger like this, she'd been 22. Gathering the courage to ask Thomas about a book he was reading in the university library. That single moment of bravery had led to 30 years of happiness. Now, at 57, she felt that same mix of fear and possibility. Michael was so absorbed in his impromptu assessment that he didn't hear her approaching. He had moved on to examining the barn's massive support beams, running his hands along the wood, reading its history through his fingertips. A lifetime of construction experience told him that while the barn needed work, it was far from beyond saving. The thought stirred something in him that he'd tried to forget, the satisfaction of seeing potential where others saw only ruin. The sound of footsteps on gravel finally caught his attention. Turning, he found himself face to face with an elegant woman in her 50s, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a neat chignon, her posture speaking of both authority and uncertainty. Her clothing was expensive but understated, and her expression was one he couldn't quite read. "I see you've fixed the door," she said, her voice calm but not unwelcoming. Michael straightened, acutely aware of his worn clothing and unshaven face. "I'm sorry for the intrusion, ma'am. I was just looking for a place to spend the night. I'll be moving on in the morning." Sarah looked past him to the cleaned window, the swept floor, the wildflowers in their makeshift vase. Each detail confirmed what she'd observed from the house. This was a man who cared about doing things right, even when he thought no one was watching. "Actually," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, "I was wondering if we might be able to come to an arrangement." Michael's first instinct was to decline whatever offer was coming. Experience had taught him that charity often came with invisible strings, and pride was one of the few possessions he had left. But something in the woman's eyes, a mixture of determination and vulnerability, made him pause. "I've been watching you work," Sarah continued, gesturing toward the repaired door. "You clearly know what you're doing. Have you been in construction long?" A familiar knot formed in Michael's stomach. The question was innocent enough, but it led down paths he preferred not to travel. "I've picked up skills here and there," he said carefully, defaulting to the vague answers that usually discouraged further questions. Sarah nodded, noticing his reticence but choosing to focus on the present. "Well, your picked-up skills are more impressive than the last 3 contractors I hired. That door has been hanging wrong for 2 years, and you fixed it in a morning." She moved further into the barn, her eyes taking in the swept floor, the cleaned window, the carefully arranged wildflowers. Each detail reinforced her decision. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Foster," he supplied, then added, "Michael." "Michael," she repeated, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Lancaster. This is my property, and as you can probably tell, it needs help. A lot of help." Michael shook her hand, noting the warmth of her grip and the absence of the hesitation he often encountered from people in her apparent social position. "Mrs. Lancaster, I appreciate what you might be suggesting, but—" "Please," she interrupted, "hear me out. I'm not offering charity. I'm proposing a business arrangement. She gestured to the barn around them. You've done more caring work here in one morning than I've seen from paid professionals in months. I need someone who understands old buildings, someone who can see what needs to be done and knows how to do it right. The practical part of Michael's mind was already cataloguing the repairs the property needed, even as he prepared to refuse. The roof would need attention before winter, the gutters were clearly clogged, and just from his walk to the barn, he'd spotted enough work to keep a crew busy for months. I can offer you the apartment above the garage, Sarah continued, pressing forward before he could object. It's small but comfortable. In exchange for room and board, we can discuss a fair wage for the work that needs doing. No strings, no charity. Just honest pay for honest work. Michael looked down at his worn boots, buying time to think. The offer was tempting. More tempting than he wanted to admit. Winter was coming, and the prospect of facing another cold season on the road held little appeal. Still, he'd learned the hard way that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Mrs. Lancaster, Sarah, please. Sarah, he amended. Your offer is generous, but you don't know anything about me. I could be anyone. A slight smile touched her lips. I know you spent an hour fixing a door that's not yours. I know you cleaned a window no one asked you to clean. And I know you brought flowers into a dusty old barn simply because it needed something beautiful. She paused, meeting his eyes directly. Sometimes that tells you more about a person than any resume could. Michael found himself at a crossroads. The sensible thing would be to walk away, to stick to his pattern of temporary jobs and moving on before people could ask too many questions. But he was tired of running, tired of letting his skills go to waste on quick fixes when he could see the potential for real restoration. 2 weeks, he said finally. Let me stay 2 weeks. I'll help with the urgent repairs, get you set up for winter. After that, we can both decide if a longer arrangement makes sense. Sarah's smile widened, genuine relief flooding her features. 2 weeks, then. She gestured toward the garage. Shall I show you the apartment? As they walked across the leaf-strewn lawn, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something bigger than a simple work arrangement. Sarah, for her part, felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. Neither of them spoke much, both lost in thoughts of what this unexpected arrangement might bring. The late morning sun cast their shadows long across the grass, 2 silhouettes moving in tandem toward what would prove to be a new beginning for them both. The garage apartment exceeded Michael's modest expectations. A thorough cleaning and minor repairs would make it more than comfortable, though the thought of staying in one place still unsettled him. He had just finished bringing in his few possessions when Sarah's voice called from below. Dinner will be ready in an hour, she announced. I thought we could discuss the property over a meal if you're comfortable with that. The invitation caught him off guard. He'd assumed their arrangement would be more distant, professional. You don't have to feed me, he called back. The apartment is more than enough. Nonsense, came the reply. Everyone needs to eat. 7 o'clock in the kitchen. Michael spent the next hour making himself as presentable as his limited wardrobe. Aloud, he trimmed his beard, smoothed his least-worn shirt, and tried to remember the social graces that had once been second nature. By the time he approached the kitchen door, the aroma of home cooking had awakened hunger he hadn't realized he'd been suppressing. Sarah had prepared a simple but elegant meal, roasted chicken, vegetables from her garden, and freshly baked bread. She'd set places at the kitchen island rather than the formal dining room, a deliberate choice to keep the atmosphere casual. Still, Michael hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware of the vast gulf between their circumstances. The vegetables are from my own garden, Sarah said, breaking the awkward moment, though I'm afraid it's not what it used to be. Thomas, my late husband, he was the one with the green thumb. Michael recognized the offering of personal information for what it was, a bridge across their differences. My grandmother kept a garden, he offered in return. "She taught me the importance of good soil preparation, said you couldn't expect anything worthwhile to grow in neglected earth." "Wise woman," Sarah replied, serving the food with practiced grace. The same could be said for many things, couldn't it? They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, both adjusting to the novelty of sharing a meal with a stranger. Michael's manners, Sarah noticed, were impeccable. Despite his obvious discomfort with the formal table settings, he held his cutlery with the unconscious ease of someone who had once been accustomed to fine dining. "Tomorrow," Sarah said, breaking the silence, "I thought we might walk the property together. There's quite a bit to cover, and I'd value your professional opinion on what needs immediate attention." Michael nodded, grateful for the shift to practical matters. "I noticed the gutters need cleaning before the fall rains start, and there's some wood rot around the second-floor windows that should be addressed." "You saw all that just walking to the barn." "It's habit," he admitted. "I tend to notice things that need fixing, like broken barn doors." There was a gentle teasing in her tone that surprised them both. A small smile touched Michael's lips. "Like broken barn doors." The conversation flowed more easily after that, focusing on the practical needs of the property. Sarah found herself impressed by his knowledge, the way he could explain complex repairs in terms she could understand without being condescending. For his part, Michael gradually relaxed as they discussed the work ahead, his passion for craftsmanship occasionally breaking through his reserved demeanor. As they finished their meal, Sarah realized she hadn't eaten dinner with another person in her kitchen since Thomas passed. The thought brought a familiar pang of grief, but it was softer now, tempered by the simple pleasure of shared conversation and purpose. "Thank you," Michael said as he rose to help clear the dishes. It's been a long time since I had a home-cooked meal." Sarah watched as he competently loaded the dishwasher, noting how he took care to arrange everything efficiently. Even in this simple task, his attention to detail was evident. "Well," she said, "I always cook too much, for one person anyway. And decisions about historic properties are best made over good food, don't you think?" The question hung in the air between them, both understanding she was offering more than just meals. She was offering routine, normalcy, a chance to rebuild. Something more than just buildings. "Yes," Michael agreed quietly, "I suppose they are." The morning light painted long shadows across the estate as Sarah and Michael began their walk. She'd prepared for the inspection with a notebook and her father-in-law's old Polaroid camera, determined to document everything properly. Michael carried his worn leather tool belt, though she noticed he'd added a small notebook of his own, tucked into one of its pockets. "The house was built in 1892, Sarah explained, as they started at the main entrance. "Thomas's great-grandfather was one of the first railroad investors in the valley. The family maintained it well until about 10 years ago, when Thomas's health started declining." Michael ran his hand along the stone foundation, his expression focused. "The construction is solid. They used local granite, which tends to age well. But see these hairline cracks?" He pointed to barely visible lines in the mortar. "Water's getting in there during freeze-thaw cycles. We'll want to repoint these before winter." Sarah scribbled in her notebook, impressed by his immediate identification of issues she hadn't even noticed. As they moved around the house, Michael's expertise became increasingly evident. He spotted potential problems with the precision of a doctor diagnosing symptoms. But there was something more in his observations, a genuine appreciation for the house's character. "These windows are original," he noted, examining the wooden frames. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary. It would be a crime to replace them with modern vinyl, like some contractors might suggest. They just need proper restoration, stripping, repair and repainting." "You sound like Thomas," Sarah said softly. "He always insisted on preserving the original elements whenever possible." Michael nodded, understanding. "Modern materials have their place, but there's something special about these old techniques. The workers who built this place, they weren't just doing a job. They were creating something meant to last generations. They continued their inspection, moving from the main house to the various outbuildings. At each stop, Michael made detailed notes about needed repairs, prioritizing them based on urgency. Sarah found herself repeatedly surprised by his thoroughness and his ability to explain complex issues in terms she could understand. Near the old greenhouse, Michael paused longer than usual, studying the iron and glass structure with particular interest. "This is remarkable," he said, almost to himself. "You don't see Victorian greenhouses like this anymore. The ventilation system is ingenious." "It hasn't been used in years," Sarah admitted. "The heating system failed and we just let it go." "The bones are good," Michael said, already making notes. "The glass panes need resetting and the mechanical systems need updating, but it could be beautiful again. Practical too. You could grow year-round." Something in his voice made Sarah look at him more closely. For a moment, his professional reserve had slipped, revealing genuine enthusiasm. She recognized the look. It was the same one Thomas would get when discussing his restoration projects. As they completed their circuit of the property, returning to the barn where their unlikely partnership had begun, both felt a subtle shift in their dynamic. The project ahead was daunting, but there was also a sense of possibility that hadn't existed 24 hours ago. "Well," Sarah said, reviewing her notes, "what's your professional assessment?" Michael hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's a significant undertaking. The property needs comprehensive attention, but nothing I've seen is beyond repair. The real challenge will be prioritizing the work to prevent further deterioration while planning for long-term restoration." Sarah appreciated his honesty. "And you think 2 weeks is enough time to get the critical repairs done before winter?" "For the emergency repairs, yes," he replied. "But—" He trailed off, looking around at the property with what Sarah now recognized as a craftsman's eye. "But," she prompted, "but it seems a shame to just patch things up when there's so much potential here. This estate deserves more than just emergency repairs. It deserves to be brought back to life properly." Their eyes met, both aware they were discussing more than just property maintenance. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. News traveled fast in Millbrook Valley. By the time Sarah visited Morton's Hardware for supplies 3 days later, the whispers had already taken root. She felt the stares as she examined paint samples, heard the hushed conversations that stopped. When she approached the counter, "Mrs. Lancaster," Eleanor Morton said, her concern barely masked by politeness, "we've been hearing some unusual reports about your property." She paused, clearly choosing her next words carefully. "About a stranger you've taken in." Sarah met the older woman's gaze steadily. "I've hired someone to help with repairs, Michael Foster. He's quite skilled." "Hired?" Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "That's not what we heard. Martha from the grocery store said he looked, well, homeless." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Sarah felt a surge of protective anger she hadn't expected. "Appearances can be deceiving, Eleanor. His work speaks for itself." Meanwhile, across town, Michael was experiencing his own version of small-town scrutiny at the lumberyard. He'd gone to price materials for the greenhouse restoration, only to find himself under the suspicious gaze of the yard manager. "That's quite a list," the manager said, examining Michael's carefully detailed material requirements. "This for the Lancaster place?" "Yes, sir." Michael kept his tone professional, though he could feel the weight of judgment in the man's stare. "Mrs. Lancaster approve these expenses?" The question carried an edge of accusation. Michael straightened, drawing on dignity he'd forgotten he possessed. "You can call her to confirm. I'll wait." The manager's face reddened slightly. "Just doing due diligence, you understand. Mrs. Lancaster's been through enough since Thomas passed. Town looks out for its own." Back at the estate, Sarah was surprised to find her friend Margaret's car in the driveway. Margaret, a local real estate agent and self-appointed guardian of proper behavior, sat primly on the front steps. "Sarah, darling," she called out as Sarah approached, "we need to talk about your situation, my situation. Sarah set down her shopping bags, already tired of the conversation. Don't play coy. You have a strange man living on your property. Do you have any idea what people are saying? What if he's dangerous? What if he's just after your money? Sarah thought about the careful way Michael had documented every repair, the detailed lists of materials and costs he presented each evening, his obvious discomfort at accepting even the smallest kindness. He's not after my money, Margaret. How can you be sure? Men like that, men like what? Sarah interrupted, her patience finally snapping. Men who fix broken things, who work from sunrise to sunset, who treat this property with more respect than any contractor you've recommended. Margaret stood, smoothing her skirt. I'm just concerned, we all are. Ever since Thomas, well, you haven't been yourself. Making impulsive decisions, taking unnecessary risks. Later that evening, as Sarah relayed the day's events over dinner, she was surprised to see a flash of amusement cross Michael's face. The lumberyard manager. And called you, she realized. That's why you're not surprised. And the hardware store, he admitted, and probably half the businesses in town by now. His expression grew serious. They're right to be concerned. You did take a risk. A calculated one, Sarah corrected. Besides, I'm tired of living according to other people's concerns. This is my property, my decision. Michael was quiet for a moment, pushing food around his plate. I could move on, he offered finally. Save you the trouble of, don't you dare, Sarah cut him off. Unless you want to leave, you're staying. The town will just have to adjust. Their eyes met across the table, something unspoken passing between them. For the first time in years, Sarah felt truly in control of her life, defending not just Michael's presence, but her own right to choose her path. As if to punctuate her decision, they heard the distant rumble of thunder. The first autumn storm was rolling in, and there was work yet to be done. A week into their arrangement, patterns emerged like delicate frost on a window pane. Sarah found herself rising earlier, drawn by the sound of Michael's footsteps on the gravel path as he began his morning inspection of the property. She'd watch from the kitchen window as he methodically checked his repairs from the previous day, cup of coffee warming her hands. Sometimes, without planning it, she'd find herself walking out to meet him, bringing a second cup of coffee. They'd stand in comfortable silence, steam rising from their mugs, as they watched the sun climb over the eastern trees. Michael would point out things she'd never noticed about her own property, the way certain stones in the wall caught the morning light, how the old oak trees had grown to protect the house from summer sun while allowing winter warmth. The kitchen had become their unofficial meeting place. Sarah discovered that Michael was an early riser like herself, and their informal breakfasts became a daily ritual. She found herself looking forward to these quiet moments when they'd discuss the day's projects over toast and eggs. The greenhouse. Glass arrived, Michael mentioned one morning, adding honey to his tea, a preference Sarah had quietly noted and provided for. Should be able to start installation tomorrow. I've been meaning to ask, Sarah said, watching him spread jam on his toast with the same precision he brought to his work. Where did you learn so much about Victorian greenhouses? A shadow crossed his face, brief, but she caught it. I used to restore them, he said after a pause. Specialized in historical structures. Another pause. In another life. She didn't press, though curiosity gnawed at her. Instead, she found herself sharing her own memories. Thomas and I used to grow orchids in there. He was fascinated by them, said they were like puzzles, each type needing its own particular care. Michael looked up, meeting her eyes. We could set up an orchid section, he offered. The original design included specialized growing areas. Would you like that? The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. It was the first time either of them had spoken about future projects beyond the initial repair list. Their days fell into a rhythm. Mornings belonged to planning and detailed work. Afternoons often found them working in tandem, Michael on repairs, while Sarah sorted through years of accumulated items in various outbuildings, occasionally calling him over to examine some discovered treasure. She noticed how he treated every aspect of the property with respect, from the grandest architectural details to the simplest hinges. He worked with a quiet intensity that reminded her of a surgeon, each movement deliberate and purposeful. Sometimes she'd find him running his hands along the grain of old wood, reading its history through his fingertips. The evening meals had evolved too. What started as a formal obligation had softened into something more natural. Sarah found herself looking up old recipes, enjoying the simple pleasure of cooking for someone who appreciated not just the food, but the care that went into preparing. One evening, she heard music drifting from the garage apartment, gentle guitar notes floating on the autumn air. She hadn't known he played. The melody was something old and familiar, though she couldn't place it. She stood listening in the gathering dusk, realizing how the property felt different now, less like a museum of memories and more like a living, breathing space again. Their conversations grew easier, though they still carefully avoided certain topics. She never asked about his past, and he never pressed about her family's occasional phone calls that left her quiet and withdrawn. Instead, they talked about the property, about craftsmanship, about the satisfaction of bringing old things back to life. "It's strange," Sarah said one evening as they reviewed the day's progress, "but I'm starting to see the place differently. Through your eyes, maybe." Michael looked up from his notes. "How so?" "Before, I saw all the decay, everything that was lost or broken. Now I'm starting to see the potential again, the possibilities." He nodded, understanding more than she'd said. Sometimes it takes a fresh perspective to see what's still solid underneath. What can be saved? The words hung between them in the comfortable quiet of the kitchen, carrying echoes of meaning neither was quite ready to explore. The weather alert came just before sunset. Michael was securing tools in the greenhouse when Sarah hurried across the lawn, her tablet in hand. "They're saying it's going to be worse than expected," she called out. "Possible high winds and flooding." Michael studied the darkening sky, noting the peculiar greenish tint to the clouds. His years on the road had taught him to read weather like a book. "We need to secure the site. That greenhouse glass we just installed won't handle debris." They worked together as darkness fell, their movements quick but methodical. Michael showed Sarah how to help him place protective boards over the new greenhouse panels, their hands brushing occasionally as they passed tools back and forth. Thunder rolled in the distance, growing closer with each rumble. "The barn," Sarah suddenly remembered. "There's still equipment stored in there from the renovation." Without discussion, they headed across the property together, the wind picking up around them. Inside the barn, they worked by flashlight beam, moving valuable tools to higher ground. "The old drainage system might not handle this much rain," Michael said, his voice tight with concern. "We should check the basement of the main house." The first heavy drops began to fall as they made their way back. By the time they reached the house, the rain was coming down in sheets. In the basement, their flashlights revealed what Michael had feared: water beginning to seep in through the foundation. "There are sandbags in the garage," Sarah said, already heading for the stairs. Thomas always kept them ready, just in case. For the next hour, they worked side by side in the storm, placing sandbags and diverting water flow. Sarah's hair was plastered to her face, her expensive cardigan soaked through, but she never hesitated. Michael found himself impressed by her determination, the way she threw herself into the physical labor without complaint. A massive crack of thunder shook the house, and suddenly the power went out, plunging them into darkness broken only by lightning flashes. In that moment, Sarah stumbled against Michael, her hand grabbing his arm for balance. The touch lingered a moment longer than necessary. "We should check the rest of the house," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. In the beam of their flashlights, water was beginning to pool near the kitchen door. They moved through the darkened rooms together, securing windows and placing towels against doors. Each thunder crash seemed to bring them physically closer, until they were working in unconscious synchronization, anticipating each other's movements. "Look," Michael said suddenly, pointing to the ceiling of the main hall. A small, dark stain was spreading across the ornate plasterwork. "Water's getting in somewhere above." Without hesitation, Sarah led the way to the attic stairs. "There's a dormer window up there that's given us trouble before." The attic was a maze of shadows, their flashlight beams catching dust motes in their light. They found the leak, a small but steady stream of water coming in around the window frame. Michael examined it quickly, then pulled off his flannel shirt, leaving him in a t-shirt. "We can use this to block it temporarily," he said, wadding up the shirt and pressing it into the gap. As he worked, Sarah's flashlight beam caught the definition in his arms, the careful strength in his movements. She looked away, quickly, suddenly, conscious of their proximity in the cramped space. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the window, making them both jump. Sarah found herself reaching for Michael's arm again, and this time neither of them moved away immediately. "We should go back down," Michael said softly, though he didn't move. "Check the other rooms again." But they stood there for a moment longer, close enough to feel each other's warmth in the chilly attic air. Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating their faces, and in that brief moment, each saw something in the other's eyes that changed everything. The spell was broken by a loud crash from outside. They hurried to the window just in time to see one of the old oak trees swaying dangerously close to the greenhouse. Without a word, they both turned and headed back downstairs, their focused professionalism restored. But something had shifted between them as surely as the storm was reshaping the landscape outside. The morning after the storm brought clear skies and an unexpected visitor. Sarah was assessing the storm damage with Michael when a sleek BMW pulled up the driveway. Her daughter Jessica stepped out, designer boots crunching on scattered debris. "Mom," Jessica called out, then stopped short at the sight of Michael. Her eyes narrowed, taking in his worn work clothes and the easy familiarity with which he stood beside her mother. "Jessica," Sarah said, surprise and tension evident in her voice. "I didn't know you were coming." "Clearly," Jessica replied, her gaze fixed on Michael. "Margaret called me. Said you'd hired some drifter to live on the property." She pulled out, her phone tapping rapidly. Though hired might not be the right word, considering who he really is. Michael went still, his face draining of color. Sarah looked between them, confusion turning to concern. "What are you talking about?" Jessica turned her phone around, displaying a news article from 3 years ago. The headline read, "Foster Construction Collapse, Award-Winning Builder Files. Bankruptcy." Below it was a photo that made Sarah's breath catch. Michael in a suit, younger and clean-shaven, accepting a business award. "Michael Foster," Jessica read aloud, "CEO of Foster Construction, filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy today following the collapse of several major development projects. Foster, known for his innovative approach to sustainable luxury homes, reportedly lost everything after 3 clients declared bankruptcy mid-project." "Stop," Michael said quietly, but Jessica continued. "The company's collapse affected dozens of employees and subcontractors. While Foster ensured all client deposits were returned, many workers faced sudden unemployment. His current whereabouts are unknown." Sarah stared at Michael, seeing him with new eyes. All the pieces suddenly fit. His expert knowledge, his understanding of high-end construction, the careful way he'd avoided talking about his past. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly. Michael's shoulders sagged. "How could I?" "Hello, I'm your homeless handyman, but don't worry. I used to be a successful businessman until I lost everything." His laugh was bitter. "Would you have trusted me then?" "You should have given me the chance," Sarah said, hurt creeping into her voice. "Mom," Jessica interrupted, "this man lost millions. He bankrupted his own company. How can you be sure he's not just here to what?" Michael cut in, his voice sharp. "To steal from your mother? To con her?" He pulled out his worn notebook, flipping it open. "Every receipt, every expense, every hour worked. It's all documented. I haven't taken a single thing I haven't earned. Then why hide who you are? Jessica demanded. Because sometimes who you were hurts too much to talk about, Sarah answered before Michael could understanding, flooding her face. Because sometimes it's easier to be nobody than to explain how you lost everything. Michael looked at her, surprise and gratitude warring with shame on his face. I should have told you, he admitted. But at first, it was just going to be 2 weeks. Then, he gestured helplessly at the property around them. Then it became something more. I didn't know how to bring it up without risking this. What exactly happened? Sarah asked gently, ignoring Jessica's sound of protest. Michael was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the estate they'd worked so hard to restore. I had a choice, he finally said, when everything started falling apart. I could have protected myself legally, could have kept my personal assets. But that would have meant leaving my clients and employees holding the bag. He met Sarah's eyes. I couldn't do that. Every penny I had went to making things right. My reputation was shot anyway, but at least I could sleep at night. And your wife? Sarah asked, remembering the careful way he'd avoided personal topics. She didn't understand. Said I chose strangers over our future. He shrugged. Maybe she was right. Jessica made a skeptical noise, but Sarah held up her hand to silence. Why didn't you start over with your skills, your experience? Pride, maybe, shame. After a while it was easier to just keep moving, do honest work with my hands, no complications, no expectations. He looked around at the property, at the improvements they'd made together, until now. Sarah stepped closer to him, ignoring Jessica's intake of breath. You've rebuilt so much here, she said softly. Maybe it's time to rebuild your own life too. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and fear. Then Jessica cleared her throat loudly. Mom, can we talk? Privately. Sarah turned to her daughter, steel entering her voice. Yes, we can. And then you're going to listen to me. Explain some things about second chances and about judging people by who they are now, not who they used to be. Word travels even faster in small towns when there's something juicy to share. By the time the weekly town council meeting convened the following evening, Michael's story had grown into something barely recognizable. Sarah sat in the back of the town hall, listening to the whispers around her, each one more outlandish than the last. I heard he lost millions in gambling debts. My cousin in Cincinnati said he left investors penniless. Did you know he's been living in her garage? The meeting's agenda was supposed to be about the upcoming Harvest Festival, but Margaret quickly derailed it, rising to address the council with practiced concern in her voice. I think we need to discuss the situation at the Lancaster estate, she announced. As a community, we have a responsibility to protect our own. Sarah felt, rather than saw, Michael slip into the seat beside her. He'd cleaned up, wearing the one decent outfit he owned, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. Under the cover of darkness, she reached over and squeezed his hand briefly. Mrs. Lancaster, Council President Davidson called out, Would you like to address these concerns? Sarah stood, her spine straight as steel. I would. She moved to the front of the room, aware of every eye upon her. I've heard the rumors. I know you're all concerned. But before you judge a man based on gossip, let me tell you what I've seen with my own eyes. She turned, gesturing for Michael to join her. After a moment's hesitation, he did, standing tall despite the murmurs that rippled through the crowd. This man, Sarah continued, has done more to preserve and restore the Lancaster estate in 2 weeks than all your recommended contractors have done in 5 years. Yes, he lost his business. Yes, he's been through hard times. But do you know why he lost everything? She looked around the room, meeting hostile stares with quiet confidence. Because he chose to protect his clients and employees instead of himself. That's one version, someone called out. It's the truth, a new voice said from the doorway. All heads turned to see Tom Davidson, Jr., the council president's son and local building inspector, walking in. I did some checking after I inspected the work at the Lancaster place last week. Made some calls to Cincinnati. He nodded to Michael. Your reputation there isn't what you think. The contractors remember you as the guy who paid them out of his own pocket when everything went south, the guy who sold his house to make sure his workers got their final checks. Michael shifted uncomfortably under the attention, but Sarah wasn't finished. Since he's been here, he's documented every expense, every hour worked. He's helped me understand my property in ways no one else has bothered to. And last night, during the storm, he worked until dawn to protect not just my house, but the historical integrity of a place that matters to this entire community. She pulled out a folder she'd brought. I have here proposals from 3 different contractors about restoring the greenhouse. The lowest bid was $75,000. She paused for effect. Michael is doing it for 1/3 of that, and he's doing it right. Preserving the original Victorian design while updating it for modern use. Tom Jr. stepped forward. I've inspected his work. It's some of the finest craftsmanship I've seen in 20 years of building inspection. Whatever happened in his past, the man knows his trade. A thoughtful quiet fell over the room. Sarah pressed her advantage. I'm not asking you to forget the past. I'm asking you to judge the present, to look at what's actually happening, not what you fear might happen. The Lancaster estate, she continued, her voice softening, has been part of this community for over a century. Thomas and I were blessed to be its caretakers for 30 years. Now I'm asking for your trust, not just in Michael, but in my judgment, in my right to choose who helps me preserve this piece of our town's history. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. Eleanor Morton stood up from her seat in the front row. Sarah's right. She turned to face the crowd. We've all seen the improvements to the property, and she looked at Michael, a slight smile touching her lips. He's been nothing but polite and professional every time he's come to the hardware store. Pays his bills promptly, too. One by one, others began to speak up. The owner of the lumber yard mentioned Michael's expert knowledge of historical materials. The cafe owner praised his quiet courtesy during morning coffee runs. Even Margaret, though she still looked skeptical, had to admit the estate was looking better than it had in years. Finally, Council President Davidson cleared his throat. Well, I think we can all agree that actions speak louder than rumors. Now, about that harvest festival. As the meeting returned to its intended agenda, Sarah felt Michael's hand brush against hers. Looking up, she saw in his eyes something she hadn't seen before. Hope, and perhaps something more. They slipped out quietly, leaving the council to their planning. Under the stars, walking back to the estate, Sarah finally broke the silence. Are you okay? Michael was quiet for a moment. No one's defended me like that since, well, for a long time. You defended yourself, she reminded. Him. Every day through your work, your integrity. She stopped, turning to face him. The question is, are you ready to stop running? In the moonlight, his smile was soft and genuine. I'm starting to think I might be. The morning after the town council meeting, Sarah found Michael in the greenhouse, meticulously measuring the angles of the Victorian iron framework. Sunlight streamed through the newly installed glass panels, casting geometric shadows across his focused face. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. I brought coffee, she said, holding up 2 steaming mugs, and I have a proposition for you. Michael looked up, a hint of wariness crossing his features. Since his past had come to light, there was a new vulnerability to him, as if he was still unsure of his footing in this changed landscape between them. What kind of proposition? He asked, accepting the coffee with a grateful nod. Sarah pulled out a leather portfolio she'd retrieved from Thomas's study that morning. I want to restore the entire estate, not just repairs, a full restoration, and I want you to oversee it. Michael's hand stilled halfway to his mouth. Sarah, let me finish, she said, opening the portfolio to reveal architectural drawings from the estate's original construction. Thomas always dreamed of doing this. He had plans, ideas. She spread the drawings out on a workbench. But he never found anyone who understood his vision of preserving the past while adapting for the future. Until now. She watched as Michael's professional interest overcame his hesitation. He set down his coffee and leaned over the drawings, his fingers tracing the intricate details of the original design. "These are remarkable," he murmured. "The attention to detail, the way they integrated the landscape into the architecture." "I want to do it right," Sarah said softly, "not just for Thomas, but for the future, and I want you to help me create that future." Michael straightened, running a hand through his hair. "A project like this, it would take months, maybe a year. A proper budget, a crew." He trailed off, the ghost of his past failures flickering across his face. "I trust you," Sarah said simply, "and after last night I think the town is starting to as well." He turned to look at the greenhouse around them, his own handiwork merging seamlessly with the historical structure. "We could restore the original garden layout," he said slowly, beginning to think aloud. "Create zones for different growing conditions. The Victorian engineers were brilliant with passive heating and cooling systems." Sarah smiled, recognizing the spark of passion in his voice. She pulled out another document from her portfolio. "I had my lawyer draw this up this morning. A proper contract. Fair wage, profit sharing on the restoration, and..." She paused, gathering her courage. "If you want it, partnership in whatever we create here." Michael's eyes widened. "Partnership? The greenhouse isn't just about restoration," she explained. "I've been thinking about Thomas's orchids, about your knowledge of historical gardens. We could create something special here. Classes, tours, maybe even a small business growing heritage plants." She watched as he absorbed the idea, seeing him begin to picture the possibilities. His hands moved over the drawings with growing confidence, his mind clearly already solving problems, seeing solutions. "We could use sustainable materials," he said thoughtfully. "Combine historical techniques with modern efficiency. The barn could become a workshop for traditional crafts demonstrations." "Is that a yes?" Sarah asked, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. Michael was quiet for a long moment, looking around at what they'd already accomplished together. "You're really willing to take this chance? After everything you know?" "I'm willing to take a chance on who you are now," she said. "On who we could be together." Their eyes met, the morning sunlight painting everything in shades of possibility. Michael picked up the contract, reading it carefully. When he looked up again, something had shifted in his expression. The wariness replaced by determination. "One condition," he said. "We do this right. No cutting corners, no compromising on quality. Whatever we build here has to last." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest, recognizing in his words an echo of her own hopes, not just for the estate, but for what was growing between them. "I wouldn't have it any other way," she replied, and held out her hand to seal the deal. When their hands clasped, they both knew they were agreeing to more than just a renovation plan. The sound of multiple cars crunching up the gravel driveway broke the peaceful Sunday morning silence. Sarah looked up from her garden plans to see 3 vehicles pulling up: Jessica's BMW, her son Peter's Range Rover, and their Aunt Catherine's Mercedes. Her heart sank as she recognized the familiar signs of a family intervention. Michael, who had been reviewing supplier quotes nearby, tensed visibly. "Should I make myself scarce?" "No," Sarah said firmly, reaching for his hand. "We face this together." Jessica led the charge, her heels clicking purposefully across the patio stones. Peter, a banker from Boston, followed with a folder tucked under his arm. Aunt Catherine, Thomas's sister and family matriarch, brought up the rear. Her expression, "A grave." "Mother," Jessica started, but Sarah cut her off. "Before you begin," she said calmly, "you should know I've already signed the contracts for the full restoration, with Michael as full partner." The explosion was immediate. Peter stepped forward, waving his folder. "Do you have any idea what you're risking? The estate is worth millions." "Which is precisely why I'm investing in its restoration," Sarah countered, "with a man who bankrupted his own company." Jessica's voice dripped with skepticism. A man who sacrificed everything to do the right thing, Sarah corrected. Have you actually looked into what happened, or are you just assuming the worst? I did look into it, Peter said. His company failed. My company failed, Michael spoke up quietly, because I chose to protect my clients and employees instead of myself, a choice I would make again. He met Peter's eyes steadily. Your father taught me about that kind of integrity, actually. Don't you dare speak about Thomas, Aunt Catherine bristled. Why not? Sarah challenged. Thomas would have understood exactly what Michael did. He always said character shows most clearly when everything else is stripped away. This isn't about character, Jessica argued. It's about you making reckless decisions, living alone in this huge house with a strange man who's done more to honor your father's vision for this place than anyone else has in 5 years, Sarah interrupted. Look around you, really look. Despite themselves, they did. The property had transformed in the past weeks. The greenhouse gleamed in the morning sun, its Victorian elegance restored. The gardens were coming back to life, paths cleared and beds freshly edged. Even the house itself seemed to stand prouder. The finances, Peter began, are all here, Michael said, pulling out his meticulously kept records. Every expense, every hour, every decision documented. I've been transparent from day one, except about who you really were, Jessica pointed out. Yes, Michael admitted, I was wrong about that. I should have trusted Sarah with the truth sooner. But I've hidden nothing else. Aunt Catherine, who had been quietly observing, suddenly walked over to the greenhouse. She ran her hand along the restored framework, examining the craftsmanship. Thomas always wanted to restore this, she said softly. He used to talk about growing orchids again. I know, Sarah said, moving to stand beside her sister-in-law. That's why it was the first major project we tackled. Michael found a way to preserve all the original mechanisms while updating the climate controls. Catherine turned to Michael. You did this? Yes, ma'am. Your brother had excellent taste in architecture. The original design was brilliant. It just needed someone to understand and respect it. Something shifted in Catherine's expression. She looked between Sarah and Michael, seeing something the younger family members had missed. You're not just restoring buildings, are you? Sarah met her eyes steadily. No, we're building a future. Together. Mother! Jessica protested, but Catherine held up her hand. Enough! I see what's happening here. She turned to her niece and nephew. Your father believed in second chances, in judging people by their actions, not their circumstances. She gestured at the property around them. These are actions I think he would have approved of. Peter started to object, but Catherine wasn't finished. Your mother isn't some naive widow being taken advantage of. She's a woman who's found someone who shares her vision, her values, and yes, maybe her heart too. And from what I can see, she's chosen well. The silence that followed was broken by the distant sound of church bells. Catherine linked her arm through Sarah's. Now, I believe you promised to show me the plans for the heritage garden, shall we? As they walked toward the greenhouse, leaving Jessica and Peter standing open-mouthed behind them, Sarah felt Michael's hand brush hers. Their fingers intertwined briefly, a silent acknowledgement of what had just happened. They had faced the storm together and emerged stronger for it. The Lancaster estate had never looked more beautiful than it did on the morning of the Heritage Gardens open house. Early autumn sunlight caught the restored copper finials of the greenhouse, making them glow like warm honey. The gravel paths, freshly raked, wound through gardens that seemed to have sprung from a Victorian botanical print. Sarah stood in her bedroom, watching the first cars arrive. She could see Michael directing the parking arrangements, his confidence evident in every movement. Gone was the hesitant drifter who'd first fixed her barn door. In his place stood a man who knew his worth, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and dark jeans that somehow bridged the gap between craftsman and business owner. The Historical Society is here, he announced, finding her in the kitchen a few minutes later. And the Cincinnati Architectural Review sent a photographer. Sarah adjusted his slightly crooked collar, letting her hands linger. Nervous? Terrified, he admitted with a small smile. You? Surprisingly not. She looked around. At her transformed home, it feels right, showing people what we've created here. The first tour began in the restored entrance hall, where Michael had carefully stripped decades of paint to reveal the original oak paneling. The Lancaster estate, he explained to the gathered crowd, represents one of the finest examples of Victorian residential architecture in the valley. Our goal wasn't just to restore it, but to make it a living, breathing space for future generations. As they moved through the house, Sarah watched the visitors' faces. She saw the moment they understood this wasn't just about preserving the past. The updated kitchen gleamed with a perfect blend of period details and modern functionality. The library's restored reading nooks now featured subtle LED lighting that looked like gas lamps, but it was the greenhouse that drew the most gasps. Sunlight streamed through pristine glass panels, illuminating rows of orchids, Thomas's beloved. Flowers brought back to life under Michael's careful planning. The Victorian heating system hummed quietly, modernized but true to its original design. The orchid propagation program will be the cornerstone of our educational initiatives, Sarah explained to the Historical Society members. We're partnering with the local schools for hands-on science lessons. Eleanor Morton touched one of the restored iron brackets admiringly. I remember Thomas talking about restoring this place. He would have loved this. He would have, Aunt Catherine agreed, appearing at Sarah's elbow. Especially the way you've honored his vision while creating something new. Her knowing look took in both Sarah and Michael. The tour continued to the barn, now transformed into a workshop space where traditional crafting techniques would be taught. Michael had preserved every salvageable piece of original wood, incorporating modern safety features so subtly they seemed part of the original design. The true art of restoration, Michael explained to the architectural photographer, is knowing when to preserve and when to adapt. Every choice we made was about ensuring this place would remain vital and useful while honoring its heritage. Sarah felt her heart swell watching him. He spoke with quiet authority, his passion for the work evident in every word. The townspeople who had once whispered about the mysterious drifter now listened attentively, asking detailed questions about techniques and materials. Tom Davidson Jr. cornered them near the end of the tour. I've already had 3 calls from other historic property owners in the valley, he said. They're interested in similar restoration work. Michael glanced at Sarah, surprise and hope mixing in his expression. She squeezed his hand in response. They'd talked about the possibility of expanding their work, but hadn't expected interest so soon. As the afternoon wound down, Sarah found herself in the garden with Jessica, who had arrived late with a tentative olive branch in the form of a heritage rosebush. I was wrong about him, Jessica admitted, watching Michael demonstrate traditional window restoration techniques to a fascinated group. About both of you, really. This isn't just about the buildings, is it? Sarah shook her head, smiling, as Michael caught her eye across the garden. It never was. We were both broken in our own ways. But sometimes the things that seem most damaged just need someone to see their true value. The late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light as the last visitors departed. Michael found Sarah in the greenhouse, adjusting the misting system. For the orchids, well, he said softly, we did it. She turned to him, seeing in his face the same mix of triumph and tenderness she felt in her own heart. We're just getting started, she replied, and reached for his hand. A month after the open house, Lancaster Heritage Restorations had more work than they could handle. The garage apartment that had once been Michael's temporary shelter was now their office, its walls covered with architectural drawings and restoration. In plans, Sarah sat at the antique desk they'd restored together, reviewing their latest contract offers. The Whitman Mansion wants us to restore their conservatory, she called out to Michael, who was sketching design modifications at his drafting table. "And the Historical Society is asking about preservation workshops. We'll need to hire help," Michael said, turning to face her. His eyes were bright with an enthusiasm she'd grown to love. "I've been thinking about apprenticeships, teaching young craftspeople the traditional skills while working on these projects." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. "Like passing on what those old-timers taught you when you were starting out?" "Exactly." He moved to stand behind her chair, resting his hands on her shoulders. "It's not just about restoring buildings. It's about preserving knowledge, creating opportunities." The warmth of his touch sent familiar tingles down her spine. These casual intimacies had become more frequent lately, each one a small acknowledgement of what was growing between them. Their reputation had spread beyond Millbrook Valley. A preservation magazine was planning a feature on their work, focusing on their unique approach to blending historical accuracy with modern functionality. Even Michael's former colleagues from Cincinnati had reached out, leading to potential collaborations on larger projects. "Tom Jr. mentioned something interesting today," Sarah said, leaning back against him. "Apparently, the vocational school is looking to add a historical restoration program. They want us to consult on the curriculum." Michael was quiet for a moment, and she knew he was thinking about all the turns his life had taken to bring him here. From successful builder to homeless wanderer to respected craftsman, it was a journey neither of them could have predicted. "Life's funny sometimes," he said finally. 3 months ago, I was fixing your barn door, just hoping for a place to sleep. Now you're rebuilding more than just buildings," she finished for him, turning to meet his eyes. "You're rebuilding lives. Yours, mine, and soon students too." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows they'd restored together, casting warm light across their shared space. On Sarah's desk, a small orchid bloomed in a handcrafted wooden pot. Michael's first attempt at the woodworking skills I'm planned to teach. I never thought I'd find this again," he admitted softly. "Not just the work, but everything." Sarah stood, closing the distance between them. "Sometimes the best foundations are built on what we think are ruins," he smiled. At her words, remembering similar ones he'd spoken what felt like a lifetime ago. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the estate coming alive with their next project. Local craftspeople arriving for a weekend workshop on traditional masonry techniques. "We should head down," Sarah said, though she made no move to step away from him. "The students will be arriving soon." Michael nodded, but before they left the office, he pulled her close for a moment, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Thank you," he whispered, "for seeing what could be rebuilt when everyone else just saw wreckage." Sarah's response was to kiss him softly, a promise of more to come. They had work to do, lives to transform, and a future to build together. One crisp autumn evening, exactly 3 months after the open house, Sarah noticed something different about the garden path leading to the greenhouse. Small lanterns lined the way, their warm light reflecting off the restored copper fixtures. Her heart quickened as she followed the trail, recognizing Michael's handiwork in the careful placement of each light. The greenhouse doors stood open, releasing the sweet scent of blooming orchids into the evening air. Inside, hundreds of tiny lights twinkled among the plants, transforming the space into something magical. Michael stood in the center, beside the original Victorian fountain they'd brought back to life together. "I hope you don't mind," he said, softly as she approached. "I wanted this to be perfect." "Mind?" Sarah laughed gently. "You've turned our greenhouse into starlight. Remember that first morning?" he asked, taking her hands in his. "When I was just a stranger fixing your barn." "Door? You were never just a stranger," she replied. "Even then, I saw something in you, something familiar and true." Michael's thumbs traced circles on her palms. "You saw me when I couldn't see myself anymore. You offered me more than just shelter. You gave me a chance to rebuild everything. I thought I'd lost my confidence, my purpose." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "My heart." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out a small wooden box he'd clearly crafted himself. The joinery was exquisite, the wood polished to a warm glow. "I made this from one of the original greenhouse beams we had to replace," he explained, his voice low and tender. It seemed right, using a piece of where our story began, to ask about our future. Sarah's free hand flew to her mouth as he opened the box, revealing a vintage ring she recognized from an antique shop in town. They'd admired it together weeks ago, though she hadn't realized he'd noticed her lingering glance. "I'm not the man I was when I first walked onto your property," Michael continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I'm better, stronger, more whole, because of you, because of us. Because you showed me that sometimes the things we think are broken beyond repair just need the right person to help restore them." Going down on one knee, he held up the ring. "Sarah Lancaster, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life building a future with you, restoring whatever needs fixing, and loving you through every renovation life brings our way?" Tears sparkled in Sarah's eyes as she looked down at this man who had helped her rebuild not just her property, but her own heart. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, with all my heart. Yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the restored fountain burbled behind them, its gentle sound mixing with their soft laughter and murmured words of love. Through the greenhouse glass, the first stars of evening began to appear, witnesses to a new beginning built on the strongest foundation of all, love that sees past surfaces to the true worth beneath. On their wedding day, before the guests arrived, Sarah and Michael slipped away to the barn where their story had begun. The old structure stood proud against the morning sky, its restored weather vane catching the early light. Inside, the space had been transformed into a beautiful workshop, but the door, that first door Michael had fixed, remained unchanged, a testament to where it all started. "Hard to believe," Michael said, running his hand along the repaired hinges. "That fixing. This door would change my entire life." Sarah wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "Do you ever think about that morning? What made you stop here?" "I'd like to say it was fate," he chuckled, turning to face her. "But honestly, the barn just looked like it needed someone to care about it. Like it had good bones, just needed the right person to see its potential." "Like someone else I know," Sarah smiled, straightening his boutonniere, a single orchid from their greenhouse. Through the open door, they could see the estate spreading out before them. The gardens bloomed with late summer flowers. The greenhouse gleamed in the morning sun, and a tent stood ready on the lawn for the celebration to come. Their friends and family would soon gather to witness their union, but this moment belonged just to them. "You know," Sarah said softly, "when Thomas died, I thought my life was just about preserving the past. But you taught me it's about building the future too." Michael kissed her forehead gently. "And you taught me that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you really need." The distant sound of arriving cars told them their private moment was ending. Soon the barn would fill with guests, music would play, and they would formally join their lives together. But here, in the quiet morning light, they shared one more kiss beside the door that had first brought them together. As they walked hand in hand toward their future, the old barn stood sentinel behind them, its restored strength a promise that some things, when mended with love and care, grow stronger at the broken places.